Welcome to Building Research Relevance. My name is Stephen Shaw. I'm the chair of the Department of Educational and Counseling Psychology at McGill University. Today's topic is to talk about whether data are outliers or if those are just our clients. And this creates a whole bunch of issues related to, is research relevant? And probably one of the biggest areas when we get to this is in all research is selecting your sample. You need to, if you're doing any form of an intervention, we need to tell what is the nature of the sample. It needs to be defined very carefully. So if they're 7-year-olds with learning disabilities and a comorbid condition of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, that's a fairly well-defined sample. Sometimes it's just kids. This is important. Equally as important is who's your control group. Is it everybody? Is it also a group of 7-year-olds with learning disabilities and comorbid ADHD conditions who do not receive the intervention? These control groups, in some cases, if it's not an experimental study, it's referred to as comparison groups. But defining the samples and defining the control groups or comparison groups, depending on the study, is critically important. Right now, the idea that we have right now is just to say, does it work? We have the What Works Clearinghouse, which is entirely about that. What works? That's not the right question. The question is what works, for whom, under what conditions, and in what context. This is what you need to make research relevant. It also helps to have a theoretical orientation because then, as I mentioned before when I talked about the open source analogy model, it's much easier to know what the kernel is and what you can change and what you can't. But right now, we don't have this information. When we look at a study, let's say it's a mathematics intervention, and we use a sample of 30 people, and that's fine, there's no big deal, but we get a result, an outcome, or an odds ratio, or some other metric that indicates the degree of change. This is really tricky to interpret because sometimes if you have a sample of 30, it could be a large change for a small number of people. And it's very common to have statistically significant outcomes that show in a carefully controlled experimental study. These significant outcomes are great, but they only occur on a few people. In many cases, most people who receive the intervention have no effects. And by the way, it's also easy to consider unintended effects or side effects. We think of that as a thing in medicine, but in fact, any intervention that is strong enough to have a big positive impact also has the potential to have a big negative impact. So negative cases also need to be reported and concerned. So this is a big deal. What percentage of kids had positive change when you do any form of an intervention, and what percentage may have had a negative change? As a clinician, you need to know these things. This is how things become relevant by considering that. But it is very common to have a very powerful, well-designed study that shows outstanding effects that are statistically significant with a lot of power, yet less than a quarter of the participants actually show any positive change. 3/4 don't. Well, if you're implementing an intervention and you look at these data and you say, well, this works because it's a positive effect size, that's great. But you do need to know for how many people did it succeed, for how many people did it fail, because it's still worth implementing, even if only a quarter of the people show significant changes. But this is where it's really important to have a control group that's relevant. For example, if we have a waitlist control group, for example, this happens a lot in therapy, a waitlist control group, they're just sitting there, getting nothing. Well, often something's better than nothing, no matter what that something is. So it's really hard to say if your new intervention is really the key factor or not. But if you have another group that's receiving traditional forms of therapy, and then you're implementing a new intervention, it's a good test. And then we know if our idea is better. Then even if it shows it works better than the original old school therapy, if it works better for a quarter of the people, it's probably worth implementing because it's positive. But if it's a waitlist group that's getting nothing, and it's what you're doing is better than nothing, well, if it only works for a quarter of the people, that doesn't say very much that's relevant. Still, statistically significant, well-designed study, chances are pretty good that's going to get published. If you're a clinician doing your literature review, you're probably going to find it. And is it really useful? Is it really relevant? I don't really know. I kind of doubt it. And if you're a psychologist, the people they send to you, whether, let's say a school psychologist, since that's the profession I know best, but if a school psychologist gets a referral, it's not because it's a typical student. They don't say, this child's average and doing really well in any study. This would be the median child. They send you the kids who are really struggling. They also send you the kids who many teachers with great amount of expertise and other professionals in the school have tried new interventions and they haven't been responsive to it. The response to intervention model, which is now it's kind of morphed into, I think they call it multi-tier student supports. These are great ideas, but the kids they send us to are more likely to be in that 3/4 of the classroom that shows no change than in the 1/4 that shows big change. So our kids the kids we see are probably more likely than not to be in the non-responsive group. So even when you have something that you say, oh, okay, I have children with learning problems with ADHD about this age, this intervention seems to be effective for reading or behavior or whatever. This seems to be effective, but they compared it to a waitlist group. They, I forgot what I was going to say there. So it goes. But in those particular cases, we have a situation where these are probably the non-responders. These are probably the people we just say, oh, well, they didn't work for them. In which case, we have to be cautious of whether this is something that's to be done. But the problem is, for a clinician, when you read the information, all it says is works, didn't work. There's very rarely we say what percentage of kids did it work for, what percentage of kids did it not work for. What were the characteristics of those non-responders? What were the characteristics of the responders? Under what conditions was it effective? What is our control group compared to what? Most people will use a waitlist control group simply because you're more likely to get a positive effect. If you used a more carefully matched control group, it's a harder test. You're less likely to get a positive effect, less likely to get a publication, and we talked about that before when we talked about academic incentives. So there's incentives to publish stuff that's not relevant. This is a big deal, and especially if you're a psychologist and you work with low incidence populations, people with, let's say, intellectual disabilities or children with fairly rare issues such as psychotic disorders or reactive attachment disorder. It is very unlikely you're going to get a series of studies that exactly match your child. And this is the big part. We see a lot of low incidence folks. And in these big population studies that they may implement an intervention, a very powerful intervention, let's say literacy, and they implement it school-wide with 500 kids, just everybody in there. They tend to throw out the outliers, the ones who are just far different from everybody else. Guess what? Those aren't outliers. Those are our clients. Those are the kids we work with. We need the information. And in fact, quite often they're fundamentally and systematically removed from a lot of large-scale studies that otherwise are great studies. But they're not really productive and relevant to those of us who work with those kids who are on the tails that we just dismiss as outliers. That's ultimately what we need to make things work. This is why I like the 3-tier model that's used a lot in schools. Because if you're assessing tier 1 evaluations, and as a clinician you're working with tier 3 or more severely involved kids, then you know it's not really relevant for you. It's really kind of nice to have that distinction. In tier 2, the kids who are at risk or struggling, but yet are not don't require high intensity interventions. Well, that's great. You can tell if it's going to be relevant. But right now we treat it all the same. What works clearinghouse? Just what works, not how it works, why it works, when it works, and for whom it works, under what conditions. These are key factors if we're going to make research relevant. So when you're a clinician, you need to know, is the sample that's being assessed, is it applicable to your client? You need to know how pervasive or how widespread is a positive outcome. Is the positive outcome everybody improves a little bit? Or is it only a few people improve a lot? When you do most statistical tests, they're all lumped in. Even when we do pooled standard deviations and all that, it all kinds of gets washed out. So this is a big issue. So how many people have positive outcomes? How large is the average outcome? What is the nature of the control or comparison group? Who's positively affected? By how much? Compared to what? In what context? We don't publish this. We don't tend to write this down. If research is going to be relevant, then it either has to really test theory, which is a key part. If you're testing theory, almost by definition, you're relevant. But if it's a pure clinical study, we see this a lot in medicine. There's not a lot of medical theory. Well, there is, but it's more deep background. But there's not a specific theory that most medical research is testing. It's did it cure the cancer, did it not? But and so really there's not a lot of theory there. We do that a lot in education and psychology too. Did this therapy work? Did this intervention work? Yes or no? When we're at that, we're flying blind. And if you don't have a theory, then it really has to have all these other components to be relevant, or else it's simply a shot in the dark. As I talked about earlier, that's kind of like building bricks when what we need to have is a house. And so when we are relevant, we do need to make this distinction as consumers of research to determine whether, in the fact of considering what's an outlier, just to be dismissed from the data set, they may have dismissed your clients. And in that case, the research is not relevant to you at all. So I'd like us to see us improve some of our reporting on samples, be more mindful of how we define the samples, how we define the control groups, how we define the comparison groups. We need to define the context in which this takes place a little bit more. But really what this does is it gets, even if it is a shot in the dark that works, really what this does is creates that proof of concept. We know that this intervention can work well for some people, and it is an overall positive good. But as clinicians, we're working with a single person or a classroom or a small group of people that we need to know, does that work generalized to our kids? Yeah, overall, if you have no other information, this is positive. But in fact, you're often designing programs, IEPs, individualized education programs. That always makes me laugh when we say computer programs that create IEPs, or people in the old days used to Xerox IEPs. I think they forgot what the I stands for. It's individualized. It's not group. And most of our work, especially quantitative work, is based on group studies. Not that qualitative work is that much better, because there's, of course, issues with generalization. That's just baked in. But the quantitative work tends to be with groups and not individuals. I think both of those need to work together for those of you who are qualitative researchers, talking about how this is why we have qualitative work, so we can get more at individuals. But there are also problems with how well does it generalize. So we need to find that background. But at the very least, if you're doing a quantitative intervention study, be very cautious and careful and mindful of how your work can be relevant by considering all of these factors that make up our work. Remember, they're not out. Anytime you have an outlier, think about that. Is it pure error that led to an outlier, or is it just a typical client who may have had an atypical response to your intervention? So let's take that with you. We'll go on to the next step next week, but thanks very much, and hope you've enjoyed building research relevance. Thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.